Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Canning Conversations. This morning, I am joined by Dr. Mark Brunson. He's a professor at Utah State University in the Department of Environment and Society. He's here this morning to talk with us a little bit about Ute Ladies Tresses. Mark, what exactly are Ute Ladies Tresses?
So Ute Ladies Tresses is an orchid, which is kind of cool. You know, we think about orchids as, these hothouse plants that you grow indoors, or you find in a greenhouse, or you go to a tropical rainforest and they're hanging off the canopy. But there are thousands of species of orchids, and a couple thousand are terrestrial orchids. So they grow on the ground rather than on wood or the kinds of things that we often think about orchids growing. And so Ute Ladies Tresses is a small flower. Typically, you've got the plant looks a little bit like grass, a lot like grass. You know, it'll have a couple of long, thin leaves, and then it'll send up a flower stalk that might be 6, 8, 10 inches tall. Sometimes there's multiple stalks, and each stalk has got a number of little flowers that are in a kind of a spiral shape. And so that's why the scientific name for Ute Ladies Tresses is Spiranthes diluvialis. Spiranthes means that the flower, the inflorescence, like they call it, so basically the flower stalk is in a spiral fashion. And the diluvialis means that it likes flood.
Okay.
So this plant is listed on the Federal Threatened and Endangered Species list. It's rare, but it's found everywhere from western Nebraska to central Washington.
That's fascinating. Like you said, I don't think of Utah as a spot for orchids.
No, and it's in Utah, it's found in wet areas, but there's several spots. There are some in the central Wasatch. If anybody's familiar with the Diamond Fork area, outside of, like if you're driving from Spanish Fork and you're heading over to Price and onto Moab, Diamond Fork is about 10, 15 miles up that canyon. They just discovered a population last week around Park City.
That's exciting.
There are some populations in the Uinta Basin, kind of near Dinosaur National Monument, and then there's some in a little bit around Utah Lake, and then in Cache County.
Wow. So do they like higher elevation at all, or does elevation matter at all?
You know, it's funny. I was on a Zoom meeting yesterday with experts on this plant from across the United States. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing an assessment of the status of the species, like they do for any endangered or threatened species. And one of the things that we heard was there are populations as high in elevation as 7,600 feet in the Roaring Fork Valley of Colorado. And then there's a population along the Columbia River in central Washington that's about 750 feet above sea level. So elevation doesn't seem to matter.
Quite the range.
Yeah. What it likes is wet places. So in our local area in Cache County, it's found in, we've just last year discovered a few plants around Cutler Reservoir. That was discovered by a contractor working for the Pacific Power. And then there's some in Mendon.
Wow.
That's the ones that I look at. Those are the ones that I study.
Wonderful. Now, I imagine they're pretty hard to find unless they're blooming. Is that correct?
They're pretty much impossible to find unless they're blooming. In fact, one of the weird things about this plant is that it seems to spend a lot of its life underground. So I know. So, so there's a seed, there's the seed and the seedling. We don't know how long it takes after the seed, germinates before it grows. But then after it blooms, it can lurk under the soil surface, just under the soil surface, for years before it blooms again.
Wow, so it could be places we don't know, we just can't see it.
Right. Yeah. People yesterday were talking about populations that seem to blink on and off.
Uh-huh.
Whereas the one that the Bear River Land Conservancy owns, land in Mendon, that population has flowers every year, and they bloom from first time I usually check is Pioneer Day. That's one of the things that's one of our Pioneer Day traditions in my family is we go look to see whether the ladies' tresses have started blooming yet. Some years they haven't. This year we found 3 flowers. And then they will be done by Labor Day.
So pretty short time frame to look for them then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are there any other similar plants that they're easily confused with in our local area here?
Not really. When we're out there, so they're relatively short. We often find them, sometimes they may be only 3 inches or 4 inches above the grass. We'll be walking across and we'll see something else that's white, and so your eyes starts jumping over there. There's some white flowers, and and then you get a little closer and you go, nope, it's not a Ute Ladies Tress. It's a white clover, or there's a interesting plant called seaside arrowgrass that grows in the same pasture. But it's there's nothing really that I can think of that looks like it in our area.
Great, so easily identifiable then. You mentioned it is listed as a threatened species. Can you tell us a little bit about why it's threatened and how we can maybe help with the comeback of ladies' tresses if we can?
Well, that's kind of an interesting, so it's threatened because the Fish and Wildlife Service reviewed its status a number of years ago. I think it would have been in the 1970s or 80s. And it is pretty inconspicuous, and it's found in habitats that, don't get a lot of hikers or things like that, a lot of attention. And so they thought, well, there's hardly any of these things. And over time, partly because it has been listed on the threatened and endangered species list, they found more populations, but they're small and they're threatened by various things that could happen. For example, if a meadow were to convert to a forest, there's a good chance it would be gone. More likely, what would happen is a meadow would convert to a housing development. And then asphalt seems to be a pretty good way to eliminate this plant. And the populations are often, ours is one of the most robust in the country. But you'll hear people will say, oh yeah, we found 9 plants in this particular location. We found, like the ones around Cutler Reservoir, there were, 1, 2, 3 plants in one place that were blooming. And so we don't know how many are actually there, but not a whole lot. And so the idea with the threatened, they were moved from the endangered species list to the threatened species list as people began finding more of them. But still, those populations, if something were to happen to them, it's not, you could lose a population, and it could be the only one in the state. Nevada only has 1. Washington has maybe 3 or 4. Idaho, they know of 1 or 2, 3. It's very widely scattered, always in small populations.
Now, I imagine just the nature of them spending so much time underground and the nature of the plant and being hard to find, that it would be pretty hard to, say, try and raise them in a greenhouse and repopulate an area. Has there been any research there?
Well, there are people who have figured out how to grow them in the
Hmm.
greenhouse. It's not easy. Red Butte Garden here in Utah is one place, and then there's a university, and I've forgotten which one it was, that's also been working on this. Um, the seeds are, the plant produces many, 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 many seeds. And they're tiny, they're like dust particles. So if you think about a normal seed, it's a little bit bigger and it's got stuff in there to grow. It
Hmm.
has food that it can, endosperm. It's got food that is there so that can feed the plant as it begins to try and germinate. Ute Ladies Tresses doesn't do that. There's no, it appears to need an association with some kind of a small fungus that it can feed off of, you know. But
Fascinating. So it's
yeah,
kind of got
but
that
so
biosymbiotic relationship with the environment.
yeah, yeah. So it's not something that you can just, sow seeds, like you might, grow throw wildflower seeds out in the parking strip in your between the sidewalk and the high and your street or something like that. We really don't have good ways to regenerate it. So that's one reasons why it's important to maintain the ones we have.
Preserve what we've got.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the fungus. I'm curious if you've noticed any other kind of unique relationships between other organisms in the habitat with the lady's tresses.
We This is something we've observed in Mendon, and we don't know exactly why, but it seems to be more likely to grow where there are a few clovers. Now, clover is a nitrogen fixing plant.
Hmm.
So, it's one of the things that replenishes the nutrients in the soil. That's why they put them into pasture mixes.
Hmm.
Um, and so it might be fertilization, but it also could be that the it's growing in a pasture that's mostly grasses and grass-like plants. So it might just be that the clover are there, attract pollinators. They're there longer. And then the bees that pollinate the Ute Ladies Tresses are more likely to be there if there's clover around. Because in our pastures, there's, it's a farm field.
Hmm.
It's a hay field, and
Interesting.
so it doesn't have huge amounts of wildflowers. There's a little bit of There's a plant called Seep Indian paintbrush,
Hmm.
another sort of wetter environment liking than most of our paintbrushes. There's some Indian paintbrushes there. There's some clover planted in the field. There's a few weeds that might have, but this plant is pollinated by long-tongued bees, such as bumblebees,
Hmm.
or other bees that have a tongue long enough to be able to reach into these little kind of like tiny trumpet type of flowers. And so, that's important. We also think that the root system requires certain kinds of mycorrhizal fungi. So there's appears to be a fungus that's important for the seeds and a fungus that is important for the roots.
Interesting. So two types of fungus it needs, and probably just relying on those clovers to attract those pollinators it needs to blossom.
Yeah, yeah.
Fascinating.
When if you don't have, one of the things that they discovered was when they tried to grow them from seed, they were having no success until they started washing the seed in the water that had some dirt from where the seeds had been grown. So, you know, that tells us that there's something in that soil that's important.
Hmm.
And
Absolutely.
we don't know for sure whether the same soil microorganisms are making a difference in Cache County that are making a difference in Utah County or in Colorado or in Washington.
That's fascinating. I love the relationship that organisms have within an ecosystem.
Mhm.
It's so interesting and complex.
It is.
It really is. So if people are out and about before Labor Day, where can they look for them? You mentioned out in Mendon. Is there anywhere else they should be looking for them? And do you want them reporting any sightings?
It would be wonderful if people could report them. For the most part, these plants are growing on private land.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's true across their entire range. And that creates an interesting situation because under federal law, unlike an endangered animal, an endangered plant on private land, the landowner is not required to protect them. And some landowners would prefer that we don't find them because, or report them because they just,
Creep out.
they're distrustful. They don't want
Mm-hmm.
anybody to come along and influence, take away their options. And that's not something that can happen. The 12-acre pasture that we work in, and I'm part of the Bear River Land Conservancy, which is a local environmental conservation organization here in Cache County. We acquired that property, but if we decided at some point that that was no longer a priority, and that they wanted to sell that property and in order to protect something that was even more precious, then there would be no repercussions, and the next person could do with that property whatever they wished.
So it's a matter of landowners,
Yeah,
having that
yeah.
initiative and wanting to protect
Mhm.
the ladies'
And
tresses.
it's not something you can see from the road, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know one property where we saw some driving past, but these are folks, there's a team of us who have been counting them, a couple of us, for 8 years since when the property was just when we were getting ready to purchase the property. And so our eyes are kind of trained for them.
You're attuned to them if you've been looking for
Yeah,
8 years.
yeah. But if somebody did see some growing, say in a
Yeah.
ditch, it would my guess is it would be in a place that remains wet-ish even in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't need to be flooded, but flood irrigated land is important. Sometimes, like in Duchesne County and in Uinta County, it's found in places where there's a stream channel that only gets wet during the flood season and then isn't flooded after that. That's a typical place. Ours and some of the ones in Colorado are hay fields that are flood irrigated.
Mm-hmm. So that flood
Mhm.
cycle, they might.
Yeah, yeah. So
Interesting.
if I were looking for one, I would probably look in roadside ditches and swales.
Yeah. Do you see more blossoms in a wetter year than in drier years?
You know, we thought so, but now we don't know. So in I mentioned we started counting in 2013, or well, a little bit in 2012, but counting in earnest in 2013, where we got serious about. And we mark every single plant on our property, on the Bear River Land Conservancy property. I used to be on their board. I'm not anymore, so I'm not sure if I should say our, but um, we mark every single plant, and then we GPS them. So we have a computer database of where every single plant has been. Um, and so in 2014, we had about 800 blossoms. We thought, this is wonderful. This is amazing. Then the next couple of years, we didn't see as many. And I wasn't sure if it was because, the people who were counting changed. Maybe we weren't as well trained at finding them. Then we had a really wet summer in 2017. There was a lot of water. We were actually it was too wet to actually mow the hay, and so we were sloshing through the tall grass trying to find these things. We had almost 2,000 flowering plants, and we were just thrilled. Next year we said 130. This year we're doing pretty well. It's the third best year in the 8 years we've been sampling, and it's dry. It's
It
been
is
dry
very dry
summer,
this year.
and there have been some challenges with the irrigation, so the field isn't getting as wet as it does in some years. So then we're thinking, well, maybe it's on some kind of a 3-year cycle. That's about when the plants are ready to bloom, but we don't know that either.
Well, that will be fascinating to try and learn more about, though, in the coming years to see what happens.
I'm this is not something I do for. I'm a professor and I'm trained in ecology, but this is something I do as a community service, as part of my leisure activity. A science geek who looks at science when he's not working. And I'm hoping to do this as long as I can keep walking.
Fantastic. Well, is there anything else you wanted to share with us about Ute Ladies Tresses, or ways folks can get involved?
Getting involved. So right now we have been doing pretty well with the list of standard volunteers. That we've got people who have been coming out every year for the last 4 or 5 years, and we go once a week and we basically walk. It's a great social distancing activity because we walk about 8 feet apart and we just walk up and down the field until we cover everything. And so if somebody really thought they wanted to join that activity, they could contact me. My email is you can find me on the USU website, mark.brunson@usu.edu. That might be one thing. Honestly, if this interests you, my thing would be to say, check out the Bear River Land Conservancy, see what they do. It's private land conservation. It's not environmental advocacy. It's using, it works. It's helping people put conservation easements on their property, things like that. And so they have volunteer needs as well sometimes. And it's an organization that you might find really interesting.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I know I've passed the Conservancy many times going my way to Mendon. I think I'll take a new look on it, just passing in, knowing a little bit more about what's going on out there.
Yeah.
For sure. Fantastic. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I know I learned a lot about Ute Ladies Tresses, and we'll have a new take on them. Just the fact that there's orchids here in Utah, I had no idea. Spent time in Florida, but I had no idea they had them in my home state here in Utah.
Right.
So I really appreciate that. Any last thoughts for us?
No, I think, I don't want to take any more of people's times, but I really thank you for the invitation, and I love these plants. I love talking about them. So it was great to have this opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark.
You're very welcome.